Captain Harold Gruber counted the crates twice because the first number didn't make sense. 47 pallets of C rations and K rations had occupied this depot outside Stavelot 3 days earlier, stacked floor to ceiling in a requisitioned barn the 1st Army Quartermaster Corps had been using as a forward distribution point. The Germans took it on December 17, 1944, during the first chaotic hours of the Ardennes offensive. Now, on the 20th, with the barn back in American hands, Gruber stood in a space that looked like a tornado had ripped through a grocery store. Torn cardboard everywhere, empty tin cans by the hundreds, wax paper wrappers for biscuits and chocolate scattered across frozen mud. Cigarette butts, American cigarettes, ground into the floor by German boot heels. The depot held fuel drums too. Those sat untouched. Jerrycans of gasoline, exactly the commodity 6th Panzer Army needed to keep rolling west toward the Meuse crossings, lined up against the north wall like soldiers waiting for orders that never came. Kampfgruppe Peiper's spearhead would stall days later for lack of fuel. Some of that fuel sat right here, ignored, while German grenadiers crouched in this barn, tearing open boxes of Spam and instant coffee. Gruber's after-action inventory, filed with the Quartermaster Section of 1st Army on December 22nd, noted that ration losses exceeded 90% of stocks on hand. Fuel losses came to zero. A quartermaster officer in the adjacent unit wrote in his own report that recaptured positions across the sector told the same story. Everywhere we found evidence that the enemy had stopped to eat rather than advance. That line sits in the 1st Army G4 journal, and it captures something hard to square with any conventional reading of the battle. German soldiers in the middle of a do-or-die offensive, the last major German offensive of the war, halted their momentum to sit down and eat American food. The tactical situation didn't permit it, and they didn't have time. They stopped because they could not help themselves. This story doesn't get told in most accounts of the Battle of the Bulge, and it should. A like tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters. Subscribe if you want more of it. Drop a comment if you already knew the Germans had a ration problem this severe, because most people don't. The paradox cuts deep. These men belong to units handpicked for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the best formations the Wehrmacht could still field in late 1944. 1st SS Panzer Division, 12th SS Panzer, 12th Volksgrenadier. They carried orders from Hitler himself to punch through the Ardennes, split the Allied armies, and seize Antwerp. Speed meant everything. Every hour of delay gave the Americans time to reinforce, regroup, redirect armor. And yet, across dozens of captured supply points in the first 72 hours, German troops broke discipline to ransack American food stocks. Battalion-strength units lost cohesion. Officers reported difficulty pulling men away from captured dumps. One German company commander, taken prisoner near Malmedy on December 21st, told his interrogators that he had physically struck 2 of his own soldiers to get them moving again after they found a cache of 10-in-1 rations. They wouldn't leave. They sat in the snow, heating cans of stew over gasoline fires, while their unit advanced without them. Something in those crates broke the operational tempo of a German offensive. It wasn't mines or artillery, or P-47s dropping 500-pound bombs through the cloud ceiling. Cardboard boxes full of canned meat and powdered lemonade. To understand why American rations could do what American guns sometimes couldn't, stop a German advance cold, the answer reaches back months before December 1944, into the collapsing German logistics system and the staggering, almost grotesque abundance of the American supply chain. 2 armies fought in the Ardennes. One ran on 4,000 calories a day per man. The other had been slowly starving since autumn. By November 1944, 6 weeks before the offensive, the average German infantryman on the Western Front received roughly 1,700 calories a day. The Quartermaster General's office in Berlin had set the combat ration target at 3,600. The gap between policy and plate told the real story of a logistics network being bombed, strafed, and starved of rolling stock faster than anyone could patch it. The German field ration, the Verpflegung, had been deteriorating since mid-1943, but the collapse accelerated after the Allies broke out of Normandy. Rail yards that fed forward depots got hit by 8th Air Force heavies during the day and RAF Bomber Command at night. What rolling stock survived competed with ammunition, fuel, and replacement troops for space on lines that kept getting cut. Food lost. A HERE supply officer's report from Army Group B, dated November 9th, listed the daily bread allotment for frontline divisions at 350 grams per man, about 12 ounces. That bread contained between 15 and 20% streckmehl, an extender made from sawdust cellulose, ground fine enough to bind with rye flour. The smell gave it away before the taste did. Fresh from the field bakery, it carried a faintly woody, sour odor, not rotten, but wrong, the way a damp newspaper smells if you hold it too close to your face. Soldiers who wrote home about it used the word pape, cardboard. They weren't being poetic. The texture went chalky and dense within hours of baking, nothing like actual rye bread, and it sat in the stomach like wet cement. Coffee had vanished entirely from the ration by autumn. The ersatz replacement, muckefuck the troops called it, a portmanteau of a French phrase meaning fake, brewed from roasted barley, chicory root, and occasionally ground acorns. It produced a dark liquid that looked right from a distance. Up close, it smelled like burnt toast soaked in dirt. No caffeine, no warmth beyond the hot water itself. Margarine replaced butter. Tinned meat appeared once a week if supply lines held, which they increasingly didn't. The marmalade issued to units near the Eifel in early December had crystallized into a sticky amber brick. Soldiers pried chunks off with bayonets. Now compare the other side. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps shipped approximately 68 million ration units to the European theater of operations between June and December 1944. 68 million. That figure comes from the Quartermaster General's Statistical Summary for Fiscal Year 45, a document that runs to 400 pages of tables and reads like the inventory of a civilization that decided to feed an entire continent by force. A researcher named Ann Driscoll found the only surviving unredacted copy in 1987 at the National Archives Annex in Suitland, Maryland, misfiled under textile procurement of all things. 2 boxes of ration logistics data buried in a crate about wool blankets. But that's beside the point. The C ration alone delivered roughly 3,000 calories per day across 3 meal units, a meat unit, a bread unit, a dessert unit, canned pork and beans, canned hamburger steak, canned chicken and vegetables, canned ham chunks pressed into a gelatinous disc, hard biscuits, a chocolate bar, a sugar tablet, instant coffee, real coffee, with actual caffeine, toilet paper, chewing gum, and a small pack of cigarettes. The K-ration ran lighter, designed for short-duration combat, but still clocked in around 2,800 calories across breakfast, dinner, and supper boxes. Both came in waxed cardboard packaging that doubled as fire-starting material. An American rifleman in the Ardennes carried more calories on his person than a German grenadier received from his supply chain in 2 days. Factor in the 10-in-1 ration, a group feeding package designed for 10 men for 1 day, packed with canned fruits, powdered milk, real butter in sealed tins, and pudding mix, and the disparity stops looking like a logistical advantage. It looks like 2 different centuries occupying the same battlefield. The men assembling in the Eifel forest for Wacht am Rhein knew none of this in precise terms. Their stomachs knew. The bread tasted like cardboard, and the coffee tasted like dirt. That much was obvious. What they didn't know, couldn't know, sat in depots on the other side of the line, stacked in boxes they'd soon rip open with shaking hands. Ancel Keys grabbed a shopping cart at a Minneapolis grocery store in 1941 and filled it with hard biscuits, dry sausage, hard candy, and chocolate bars. He spent $12. From that cart came the K-ration, named after him, despite persistent myths about K standing for commando or some other military term. The Army's Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago took his prototype and turned it into a procurement specification that eventually landed on the desks of corporate food engineers across the Midwest, and what happened next belongs in any serious conversation about why America won the war. The K-ration contract went out to dozens of manufacturers simultaneously. Wrigley produced the chewing gum inserts, millions of small wax paper packets rolling off the same lines that made juicy fruit, retooled to stamp U.S. Army Field Ration K on each wrapper. The Cracker Jack Company in Chicago pressed the biscuits. Heinz packed the cheese spreads into flat tin cans, sized to fit inside a cardboard box no larger than a man's hand. Nestlé's plant in Fulton, New York, produced the bouillon powder and the soluble coffee packets. Real coffee, Nescafé's military variant, freeze-dried using a process the company had developed for the Brazilian government in 1938 to solve a coffee surplus problem. 4 years later, the same surplus disposal technology was feeding troops on battlefields across North Africa and Europe. The irony landed on nobody at the time. Each finished K-ration breakfast box contained a fruit bar, biscuits, soluble coffee, sugar, and a 4-cigarette pack, usually Chesterfields or Camels, depending on which tobacco company held the subcontract that month. The dinner unit swapped in canned cheese or potted meat. Supper brought a can of meatloaf or servelat sausage, bouillon powder, and a chocolate bar formulated to resist melting up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The famous D-ration chocolate that tasted like a candle but delivered 600 calories per 4-ounce bar. Hershey manufactured those bars on a dedicated line in their Pennsylvania plant, deliberately engineered to taste bad enough that soldiers wouldn't eat them as snacks. The Army's specification literally required unpalatability. Hershey complied. The C ration ran heavier and hotter. 12 cans per day, 6 M units containing meat dishes, 6 B units with bread, dessert, and accessories. The meat cans came from packing plants in Chicago, Omaha, Kansas City, the same slaughterhouse infrastructure that had fed American railroad expansion in the 1880s, repurposed at industrial scale. A single Swift & Company plant in Chicago produced 40,000 cans of meat and vegetable hash per shift, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. The production numbers for C-ration meat components alone in 1944 exceeded 1.5 billion cans. The Quartermaster General's office rounded to the nearest 100 million because precise counts became meaningless at that volume. No German equivalent existed. Not because German food scientists lacked competence. The Wehrmacht's Heeresversuchsanstalt had capable nutritionists who understood caloric density and field packaging. The raw materials didn't exist. Germany imported 70% of its fats and oils before the war. The Allied blockade and strategic bombing had reduced domestic food processing capacity by roughly a third by late 1944. German canning plants competed with ammunition factories for tin plate. American canning plants didn't compete with anything because the United States produced enough tin plate, enough steel, enough aluminum, enough waxed cardboard, enough dehydrated egg powder, enough granulated sugar, enough roasted coffee to do everything at once. The bottleneck that strangled German ration production, choose between bullets and bread, never materialized on the American side. The K-ration weighed about 2 pounds total across all 3 meal boxes. A man could carry 3 days of food in his pack and still haul ammunition, a shelter half, an entrenching tool. The packaging resisted moisture for up to 72 hours of immersion. The subsistence lab tested this by throwing sealed units into Lake Michigan in November and fishing them out 3 days later. Contents remained edible. The waxed outer carton burned hot enough to heat a canteen cup of water in under 4 minutes, which meant the packaging itself functioned as fuel. Nothing went to waste. Every component served at least 2 purposes. Nobody in Berlin or Tokyo was designing rations this way. What did a German grenadier in the Ardennes actually put in his mouth on a given day in December 1944? Start with breakfast, if the word even applies. A slice of that sawdust-cut bread, maybe 2, smeared with a scrape of synthetic margarine that tasted like machine oil mixed with lard. No butter had reached frontline units in Army Group B since September. The margarine came in gray tins, stamped with a production date from the previous spring, and it had a waxy, slightly rancid quality that coated the roof of the mouth and lingered for hours. Alongside it, a cup of that barley and chicory brew. Lukewarm, if the field kitchen had been able to set up. Cold if it hadn't, which by mid-December meant most of the time, because field kitchens, The Gulaschkanone, the troop's sardonic name for the horse-drawn cooker, couldn't operate within artillery range and couldn't move forward fast enough to keep pace with attacking units. Midday brought the hot meal, in theory, a thin soup, Kartoffelsuppe, potato soup, stretched with turnips and whatever the divisional slaughterhouse section could contribute, which by December increasingly meant horse meat, not choice cuts, offal, connective tissue, bones boiled for stock. The horses themselves came from the transport columns, animals that collapsed from overwork or took shrapnel, butchered on the roadside and carried forward in canvas sacks. A medical officer with the 12th Volksgrenadier Division noted in his unit diary that the horse meat arriving at his aid station for troop feeding smelled already turned and required heavy salting to mask the decay. The salt supply held up better than anything else in the German logistics chain, which tells its own miserable story about priorities. Evening ration, bread again, perhaps a small tin of Fleischkonserve, canned meat, if the supply column had gotten through. These tins dated increasingly from 1942 and 43 stockpiles. The meat inside had oxidized to a uniform gray-brown paste with a metallic aftertaste that came from degraded tin lining rather than seasoning. Soldiers ate it anyway. Calories are calories when the body runs at a deficit long enough. The deficit mattered physiologically in ways that went beyond hunger pangs. A man consuming 1,700 calories while burning 4,000 or more, standard for infantry in winter combat, hauling equipment through snow at altitude, enters a cascading metabolic state within days. The body consumes glycogen reserves first, then begins breaking down muscle tissue for energy. Cognitive function degrades. Decision-making slows. Fine motor control suffers, and reaction time stretches out well beyond what combat tolerates. A study conducted by the U.S. Army Medical Department after the war, drawing on examinations of German POWs captured during the Bulge, found widespread signs of protein-calorie malnutrition, consistent with weeks of sustained underfeeding, muscle wasting in the extremities, brittle hair, cracked and bleeding gums from vitamin C deficiency. These weren't concentration camp survivors. They belonged to elite Panzer and Volksgrenadier divisions. The psychological dimension ran deeper than the physical. Chronic hunger rewires priorities at a neurological level. The hypothalamus, the brain's hunger center, begins overriding higher cognitive functions when caloric intake drops below a critical threshold for extended periods. Discipline erodes not because soldiers become cowardly or lazy, but because the brain's survival circuitry seizes executive control. Food becomes the only thought that penetrates. Ancel Keys himself, the same man who designed the K-ration, documented this phenomenon in his Minnesota starvation experiment of 1945, where conscientious objectors on restricted diets became obsessive about food to the exclusion of all other interests within weeks. German troops in the Ardennes had been on restricted diets for months. So, when a grenadier from 1st SS Panzer kicked open a crate in a captured American depot and found a sealed tin of pork and beans, a chocolate bar, a packet of real coffee, and 4 Chesterfield cigarettes, all in a single box smaller than a book, his body didn't give him a choice. The smell alone would have triggered a dopamine response powerful enough to override any standing order. Hot fat, sugar, caffeine, nicotine. 4 substances his nervous system hadn't encountered in combination since before the invasion of Normandy. The officers who couldn't drag their men away from captured ration dumps weren't dealing with indiscipline. They were fighting endocrinology. Peiper's column rolled through Büllingen before dawn on December 17th and hit a 1st Division fuel dump containing approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline. His Panthers and half-tracks had been running on fumes since crossing the Our River. The fuel mattered. But what stopped the column cold? Literally halted forward momentum for a period that German accounts and American accounts disagree on by nearly 2 hours, sat in the adjacent depot building. Rations, cases upon cases of 10-in-1 group packs, C-ration cartons, K-ration boxes stacked on wooden pallets, and this detail appears in multiple after-action reports from the 2nd Division's rear echelon personnel who witnessed the aftermath. Entire crates of unopened cigarette cartons. Joachim Peiper commanded the lead Kampfgruppe of 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte. Aggressive, tactically sharp, absolutely committed to maintaining the tempo of advance that 6th Panzer Army's timetable demanded. His operation order specified continuous movement westward toward the Meuse bridges. Every hour mattered. Peiper knew this. His officers knew this. The timetable didn't care about hunger. The men who dismounted from those half-tracks hadn't eaten a proper meal in over 30 hours. They tore into the American rations with bare hands and bayonet points. One SS trooper's field diary, captured later near La Glaise, describes the scene with a single repeated word: chocolate, chocolate. He wrote it 3 times, underlined twice. The diary doesn't say much else about Büllingen. Just chocolate. Peiper's own after-action testimony, given during his war crimes trial at Dachau in 1946, doesn't mention the ration dump directly. He discussed fuel and route selection. He discussed timing. The food doesn't appear in his narrative because admitting your elite SS spearhead lost operational tempo to American chocolate bars and canned beans carries a particular kind of humiliation that a man on trial for murder at Malmedy wouldn't volunteer. But subordinate officers filled the gap. An interrogation transcript from a captured Leibstandarte Hauptsturmführer, the name is redacted in the declassified version, places the delay at Büllingen squarely on troop discipline, breaking down around captured supplies. The men could not be moved forward, the transcript reads. Their word, könnte, could not would not. The distinction matters. It echoes exactly what the endocrinology predicts. The body seizing control from the mind. The cigarettes tell their own story. A standard American cigarette carton in the ETO functioned as hard currency more reliable than occupation marks, French francs, or Belgian francs. 4 packs of Lucky Strikes bought a bottle of Calvados from a Norman farmer. A full carton, 10 packs, 200 cigarettes, could purchase a wool blanket, a pair of boots, a night's lodging, or roughly 8 hours with a black market currency dealer in Liège who'd convert them to Swiss francs at a rate that fluctuated weekly. The Provost Marshal's office tracked cigarette-based transactions as an economic indicator of rear area morale, and a sergeant in the Inspector General's section, named Morris Fine, kept a handwritten ledger of exchange rates across 6 countries from July 1944 to May 1945. That ledger surfaced in 2003 when his granddaughter donated his footlocker to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. 3 spiral notebooks wrapped in a rubberized map case, each page listing a date, a location, and a cigarette-to-commodity conversion ratio. Anyway, German soldiers hadn't seen real tobacco in weeks. The Wehrmacht issued a synthetic cigarette made from dried herbs and wood shavings that burned hot, tasted acrid, and delivered no nicotine worth mentioning. Finding a crate of Chesterfields hit the same neurochemical cascade as the chocolate and the coffee. Nicotine, sugar, caffeine, fat, all arriving simultaneously into a system that had been running on fumes and sawdust bread. Peiper got his column moving again. The fuel mattered more than the food in strictly operational terms, and the Büllingen dump gave him enough gasoline to push toward Stavelot. But the delay at the ration depot rippled forward through his timetable in ways that compounded across the next 48 hours, and by the time his spearhead reached the bridge at Stavelot, American engineers had already wired it for demolition. Minutes matter in a blitzkrieg, so does chocolate. Fritz Bayerlein swung his command car off the road near Magere on December 19th and walked into chaos. His Panzer Lehr division, one of the finest armored formations the Wehrmacht still fielded, had ground to a halt not because of American resistance, but because his lead battalion had discovered an abandoned American supply point and stopped advancing. Troops clustered around open crates like refugees at a breadline. NCOs, who should have been pushing forward, stood among them, eating. Bayerlein raged. The record shows he physically struck at least 1 soldier. It didn't matter. Panzer Lehr lost between 90 minutes and 3 hours at that dump. Sources give different figures, and Bayerlein's own post-war FMS report compresses the timeline in ways that smell like embarrassment. What he couldn't compress away. Bastogne sat 7 kilometers down the road, lightly defended, and every minute his division spent eating American canned ham brought the 101st Airborne closer to closing the perimeter. The pattern repeated across the entire offensive front at a scale that was hard to dismiss as coincidence. Charles MacDonald's account in A Time for Trumpets catalogues at least 6 major instances of German formations losing operational momentum to captured American supplies in the first 72 hours alone. 6th Panzer Army's northern shoulder, 5th Panzer Army's central thrust, even 7th Army's infantry divisions on the southern flank, which had the least ambitious objectives and the tightest timetables, reported delays attributable to troops scattering into American rear areas to scavenge food and cigarettes rather than maintaining unit cohesion. The quartermaster sections of 3 different German divisions filed near-identical complaints up their respective chains of command between December 18th and 21st. Troops abandoned march columns. Officers lost contact with platoons for periods ranging from 45 minutes to 4 hours. Assembled units that should have numbered 120 men showed 60 or 70 at assembly points, with the remainder drifting back in small groups carrying American ration boxes, cigarette cartons, and, repeatedly noted with obvious irritation by German supply officers, cans of American coffee. Coffee. Real, soluble, instant coffee that dissolved in hot water and tasted like something other than burnt acorns. The German fixation on captured coffee appears in enough independent sources that it qualifies as a phenomenon rather than an anecdote. A company commander in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division wrote in his field report that he found his entire 3rd platoon brewing American coffee in a cellar while their assigned objective, a crossroads 300 meters north, remained unsecured. He used the word Wahnsinn, madness. The operational math cuts clean. Hitler's Ardennes timetable gave the attacking armies roughly 4 days to reach the Meuse River crossings before Allied reserves could arrive in strength. 4 days, 96 hours. The plan assumed continuous forward movement with minimal pauses. German planners explicitly acknowledged that logistics couldn't sustain a prolonged offensive and that speed alone offered any chance of strategic success. Model said it. Manteuffel said it. Even Rundstedt, who thought the whole operation bordered on fantasy, conceded that only a lightning thrust had any theoretical viability. Into that razor-thin margin, subtract the accumulated delays from looting. An hour and a half at Büllingen, 2 or 3 hours for Panzer Lehr at Magaret, scattered delays across dozens of smaller units, adding 30 minutes here, an hour there, none catastrophic individually, all compounding across an offensive that stretched along a front 60 miles wide. The aggregate time loss defies precise calculation, because nobody on the German side wanted to quantify it afterward. But MacDonald's reconstruction suggests that the cumulative effect across 5th Panzer Army's sector alone cost something approaching half a day of forward momentum in the critical first 72 hours. Half a day, 12 hours, give or take, surrendered to K-ration boxes and Chesterfield cigarettes by an army that needed every minute it could steal. The Americans who abandoned those depots in panic on December 16th had no idea they'd left behind a weapon. Canned meat and chocolate bars did what minefields and roadblocks are designed to do. They broke the tempo of an armored advance. Neither side saw it coming. The caloric gap between the 2 armies turned captured abundance into drag on the advance that no operations order could overcome. What did the Germans say about it afterward? Not during the chaos, not while stuffing chocolate into their mouths, but later, sitting across tables from American intelligence officers with the war already lost. They said too much. General Major Fritz Bayerlein's FMS report, B-Series, number 41, written at a desk in Allendorf in 1946 while American officers watched, runs to several hundred pages, covering Panzer Lehr's operations from Normandy through the Ardennes. The ration dumps get 2 paragraphs, buried deep, surrounded by tactical analysis and route descriptions, as though proximity to serious military content might make the admission less humiliating. Bayerlein wrote that his troops encountered American supply installations containing quantities of rations and equipment that exceeded anything available to German forces at any point in the Western campaign. The word he chose, Übertraf, exceeded, does a lot of quiet work in that sentence. Surpassed was available, so was dwarfed. He picked the clinical option, the one that sounds like an accountant comparing ledgers rather than a general confessing that his elite division stopped fighting to eat canned ham. But the clinical language cracked in other testimonies. A Hauptmann from the 9th SS Panzer Division, interrogated at a POW cage near Namur in late January 1945, told his debriefer something that the interviewing officer underlined twice in red pencil. The German said he opened an American K-ration box expecting field bread, Kommissbrot, the dense gray loaf, and found instead a complete meal sealed in waxed cardboard, with a tin of cheese, crackers, powdered lemon drink, sugar tablets, and 4 cigarettes, real cigarettes. He held the box in both hands and stared at it. The interviewer's marginal note reads, "Subject paused here for approximately 30 seconds. Appeared emotional." 30 seconds of silence in an interrogation room. From an SS officer, the lemon drink powder needs a footnote, and the footnote turns into something larger. German soldiers encountered it repeatedly in captured K-rations and had no frame of reference for it. Powdered drink mix containing actual vitamin C, packaged as a throwaway accessory in a box designed to be eaten in 20 minutes and discarded. The Wehrmacht's entire medical apparatus had been struggling since 1943 to source enough ascorbic acid to prevent scurvy in frontline units. The condition showed up in POW medical exams as bleeding gums, loose teeth, slow-healing cuts. Americans tossed vitamin C into a ration box as an afterthought. That gap between German medical crisis and American casual abundance said more about the war's trajectory than any order of battle ever could. The Trent Park transcripts catch the same realization at higher altitude. Captured German generals, recorded without their knowledge in bugged rooms at a country estate north of London, discussed American material superiority with a bitterness that shaded into something closer to awe. General von Thoma, captured in North Africa in 42, so before the Ardennes, told a fellow prisoner that the Americans fight with equipment, not men, and meant it as contempt. By late 44, generals arriving from the Western Front used nearly identical language, but the tone had shifted. Equipment meant factories. Factories meant steel, rubber, aluminum, agricultural output, petroleum refining, a continental economy untouched by strategic bombing and fed by the richest farmland on Earth. A K-ration box contained the distilled output of that entire system. Iowa corn syrup in the chocolate, Virginia tobacco in the cigarettes, California lemon juice in the drink powder, Pennsylvania steel in the tin, and it fit in a soldier's cargo pocket. One German officer at Trent Park, recorded in December 1944, put it with a bluntness that the transcribers noted as unusual. "We cannot win against a country that feeds its soldiers better than we feed our officers." The transcribers didn't underline it. They didn't need to. That sentence contains the entire argument of this script, testimony delivered by the enemy himself in a room he believed to be private. No audience, no propaganda value. Just a man who had opened an American ration box, done the arithmetic, and arrived at the only conclusion the numbers permitted. The Ardennes offensive died in increments, not in a single dramatic collapse, and the increment that mattered most carried a Hershey wrapper. Follow the clock. Peiper's spearhead reached the outskirts of Stavelot on the evening of December 17th, roughly 12 to 14 hours behind the schedule that 6th Panzer Army's planners had drawn up in the Eifel. Some of that delay came from blown bridges, American roadblocks, narrow forest roads choked with mud. Some came from Büllingen. The bridge at Stavelot still stood when his lead vehicles arrived, but the delay had given Colonel David Gruber's engineers enough time to prepare demolition charges and position a scratch force of infantry, anti-aircraft half-tracks, and a handful of tank destroyers on the far bank. Peiper probed, pulled back, and attacked the next morning. By then, the defenders had thickened. The bridge blew. His column diverted toward Trois Ponts, where another bridge went into the Amblev River before his Panthers could cross. The route to the Meuse narrowed with each lost hour, and each lost hour traced back through a chain of causes that included, undeniably, stubbornly, the time his men spent eating American rations at a fuel dump they should have cleared in 20 minutes. 70 kilometers south, the Arithmetic hit harder. Bayerline's Panzer Lehr sat outside Bastogne's perimeter on December 19th, with the road to the town still functionally open. The 101st Airborne hadn't fully closed its defensive ring. McAuliffe's paratroopers arrived in Bastogne by truck convoy on the evening of the 18th, and their perimeter remained porous through most of the 19th, thin, improvised, held together by individual company commanders, making local decisions without a coherent division-level defense plan. Panzer Lehr's delay at Magret didn't cause Bastogne to hold. Reducing the siege of an entire town to a single variable would be dishonest, and the records don't support it. What the delay did, demonstrably, measurably, shrunk the window, during which a concentrated armored thrust might have punched through before the American perimeter solidified. By the 20th, McAuliffe had his artillery registered, his roadblocks wired, his aid stations operational. The window closed. St. Vith tells the same story from a different angle. The 106th Infantry Division's 2 regiments on the Schnee-Eifel were already surrounded and would surrender on the 19th. Roughly 8,000 men, one of the largest mass captures of American troops in the European theater. But the town of St. Vith itself held for 6 critical days under Brigadier General Bruce Clark's Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division. And those 6 days depended on German formations arriving piecemeal rather than in coordinated strength. The 58th and 66th Corps, pushing towards St. Vith from the east and southeast, reported the same supply dump delays that plagued every other German formation in the Bulge. Units arrived at their assault positions in fragments. Attacks went in with companies instead of battalions. Clark's defenders, outnumbered, outgunned, fighting from hastily dug positions in frozen ground, held because the German hammer never fell all at once. It fell in pieces, spread across hours, that the German timetable couldn't afford to lose. Pull back to the operational view, and the pattern is hard to miss. American supply dumps, positioned for convenience rather than defense, abandoned in the panic of December 16th, became obstacles more effective than many deliberate defensive preparations. Neither engineers nor tactical doctrine had anticipated them. A quartermaster stacking K-ration boxes in a Belgian barn created a time sink that no German operations officer had factored into his march tables. The caloric desperation of German troops, invisible to American planners, irrelevant to American logisticians, converted every captured depot into a friction point that degraded the tempo of advance by margins small enough to ignore individually and large enough to matter collectively. The German generals who reached the Meuse never crossed it. Peiper's Kampfgruppe ran out of fuel near La Glaise and abandoned its vehicles on Christmas Eve. Panzer Lehr ground itself to pieces against Bastogne's perimeter. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last strategic gamble, broke against time as much as against American firepower, and some of that time, an unknowable but non-zero fraction, had been spent crouched over open crates of sea rations in frozen Belgian supply dumps, hands shaking, mouths full of chocolate. 600,000 tons of supplies moved through the Normandy beach depots in June and July of 1944 alone. By December, the communications zone, COMZ, the sprawling logistical apparatus behind the combat divisions, had pushed more than 3 million tons of materiel into the European theater. Rations accounted for roughly 400,000 of those tons. The number needs a moment to land. 400,000 tons of food, canned, boxed, crated, palletized, shipped across 4,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean, trucked forward on the Red Ball Express, and stacked in barns and warehouses across eastern Belgium and Luxembourg, where German grenadiers with bleeding gums and hollow stomachs would stumble into it on December 16th and stop fighting to eat. The caloric disparity by January 1945 had become something grotesque. American combat troops in the ETO received an average of 4,200 calories per day. The official ration scale and the Quartermaster Corps came remarkably close to meeting it even during the Bulge, when supply lines bent but never broke. German troops on the same front received, according to captured quartermaster records from Army Group B, somewhere between 900 and 1,400 calories per day. The records conflict on the exact figure, and the range itself had stopped meaning much. German logisticians had stopped tracking with precision because precision no longer mattered when the system couldn't deliver regardless. 900 calories. A grown man performing heavy physical labor in sub-freezing temperatures burns through that before noon. The sound of the collapse carried a particular texture. Prisoners taken during the American counterattack in January. Patton's Third Army driving north into the Bulge's southern flank. The 26th Infantry Division clearing frozen villages house by house, described something that interrogators at 1st Army's cage near Spa heard so often they developed shorthand for it in their reports. German soldiers surrendering not after firefights, but after being found in cellars, basements, abandoned farmhouses, surrounded by empty American ration tins. The tins made a specific noise when kicked across a stone floor, a thin, hollow, metallic scraping that one interrogator described in his weekly summary as the sound you hear in every village now. He didn't elaborate. The report moved on to prisoner counts and unit identifications. But that detail, the sound of empty American cans rolling across Belgian flagstones under German boots, sat in a filing cabinet at 1st Army headquarters and said everything about how the offensive ended. General Lieutenant Fritz Kramer, Chief of Staff of 6th Panzer Army, provided the epitaph in his FMS report. Kramer wrote with the exhausted precision of a man who knew exactly when the war ended for him personally. He identified the failure of the Ardennes offensive as fundamentally logistical rather than tactical. German tactical performance in the first 48 hours, he argued, met or exceeded planning expectations at multiple points along the front. What broke the offensive, his phrase, involved the inability to maintain the tempo of advance against an enemy whose material resources rendered even his abandoned positions an obstacle to our movement. Kramer circled the same truth that the unnamed officer at Trent Park had spoken aloud in a bugged room weeks earlier. The Americans didn't need to fight well at every point. They just needed to exist at the scale they existed, and the sheer mass of their logistical presence would warp the battlefield around it like gravity-bending light. An army that can lose 47 pallets of rations at a single forward depot and never notice the gap in its supply chain occupies a different category of war-making than an army whose soldiers abandon tactical objectives to brew coffee in a cellar. The category difference doesn't require editorial comment. Bayerlein understood it, standing in the road at Magueret, watching his division eat itself to a standstill. Kramer had arrived at the same conclusion by 1946, writing at his desk with an American officer reading over his shoulder. And the grenadier from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, the one whose platoon sat in that cellar with their hands wrapped around warm cups while their crossroads objective went unsecured 300 meters north, the smell of real American coffee filling the room for the first time in years, Wonson on their commander's lips and something worse in his eyes. Recognition. The war tasted like someone else's breakfast, and it tasted better than anything they'd had in months. By 0800 on January 28, 1945, the last organized German units had pulled back across the Aar River to roughly the same positions they'd held on December 15th. 6 weeks of offensive operations, 80,000 German casualties, 600 tanks destroyed or abandoned, and the front line moved nowhere. The Ardennes Bulge flattened back to zero. The K-ration kept going. Production at the Wrigley plant in Chicago ran through VE Day and beyond, pushing out more than 105 million individual ration units in 1945 alone. The C-ration lines in plants across New Jersey, Indiana, California never slowed. By the time Jodl signed the surrender documents at Reims on May 7th, the American logistical system had delivered more than 6 billion individual rations to theaters worldwide. 6 billion meals, each one containing more calories than a German frontline soldier received in 2 full days. The system that Ancel Keys prototyped with a $12 grocery run had scaled to feed the largest military force ever assembled, and it did so with enough surplus that entire depots could fall to the enemy without anyone at COMZ headquarters blinking. The Soviets noticed too. A 1945 report from the Red Army's Rear Services Directorate, partially translated in a post-war intelligence summary held at the National Archives, assessed American field rations with a clinical fascination that reads like an engineer reverse engineering a competitor's product. The Soviet evaluators noted the caloric density, the packaging durability, the vitamin supplementation, the inclusion of morale items like cigarettes and chewing gum. Their conclusion: the American approach to field feeding reflects an industrial economy operating without meaningful resource constraints. That phrase, without meaningful resource constraints, landed harder coming from an ally than from a defeated enemy. The Soviets were measuring a gap they could not close. The Germans, for their part, tried to learn from what had beaten them. In 1944, the Wehrmacht's Heeresversuchsanstalt, the Army Research Institute, began a crash program to develop a compact self-contained individual combat ration, modeled explicitly on captured K-rations. The program file, recovered from Wehrmacht archives, contains detailed nutritional breakdowns of American ration components, hand-drawn diagrams of the waxed inner packaging, notes on the chocolate formulation. German food scientists spent months trying to replicate a product that American factories stamped out at a rate of 3 million units per week. They never succeeded. The packaging concept transferred easily enough, but Germany in late 1944 lacked the raw inputs: no cocoa, no real coffee, no citrus for vitamin C, no surplus tobacco. The design could be copied, but the economy behind it could not. They built a defense against the thing that had already killed them. And the country that fielded those 6 billion rations, the country whose casual abundance broke an SS officer's composure in a POW cage, whose lemon drink powder contained more vitamin C than the entire Wehrmacht Medical Corps could source, that country spent the next 3 decades feeding its Cold War army on refinements of the same system. Then came Vietnam, and the C-ration tin that had symbolized American plenty became a symbol of something else entirely. Troops in the Mekong Delta cursed the same canned ham and eggs that German soldiers had wept over. Ham and Mothers, the nickname unprintable in full, ranked as the most despised item in the American military diet by 1968. An army that had won a world war partly through the quality of its field rations now fielded troops who considered those rations a joke. Ancel Keys died in 2004 at the age of 100 in Minneapolis, the same city where he'd pushed a grocery cart through a supermarket and invented a way to feed an army. He'd spent his post-war decades studying the Mediterranean diet and cholesterol. The K-ration barely appeared in his later interviews. He considered it minor work. The Germans who opened those boxes in the Ardennes snow disagreed.